The fall of Benito Mussolini was not just the collapse of a dictator. It was the spectacular implosion of a man who believed he was a modern Caesar, only to be discarded like a failed middle manager by his own closest allies. On the night of July 24, 1943, in a humid, smoke-filled room in Rome, the Deuce walked into a meeting of the Grand Council of Fascism expecting a show of loyalty. Instead, he walked into a political firing squad. Within 24 hours, the man who had ruled Italy with an iron fist for 21 years was arrested in the back of an ambulance, and the streets of Rome, once filled with chants of his name, were suddenly echoing with the sound of his statues being smashed to dust. This is the incredible, high-stakes saga of the night fascism died in Italy. By the summer of 1943, the Italian dream of a new Roman Empire had become a nightmare of ash and hunger. The Italian military was broken. They had been humiliated in North Africa at El Alamein, decimated on the frozen plains of the Soviet Union. And now, the soft underbelly of Europe was soft no longer. On July 10th, the Allies launched Operation Husky, the massive invasion of Sicily. For the first time, Western democratic boots were on Italian soil. The Italian people, who had endured years of Mussolini's bombastic rhetoric about glory and sacrifice, were tired of burying their sons for a war that felt increasingly like a German occupation rather than an Italian crusade. Mussolini himself was a shock, but the coach is a self-defending creature. Mussolini himself was a shadow of the vibrant orator of the 1920s. He was plagued by chronic stomach ulcers, likely exacerbated by the stress of being Hitler's junior partner. He spent hours staring out of the windows of the Palazzo Venezia, isolated and delusional. He believed the Italian people still loved him, but the reality was far grimmer. In the factories of Turin and Milan, workers were striking, the first major labor strikes in a fascist state. The food rations were microscopic, and the Allied bombers were now appearing over Rome, dropping high explosives on the Eternal City. The conspiracy to remove Mussolini didn't start with the Allies. It started within his own inner circle. The leaders of this coup were an unlikely trio: Dino Grandi, the sophisticated former ambassador to London, Count Galeazzo Ciano, Mussolini's own son-in-law, and King Victor Emmanuel III, the diminutive monarch who had spent 2 decades hiding in Mussolini's shadow. Grandi, in particular, was convinced that Italy's only hope for survival was to break the alliance with Hitler and surrender to the Americans and British. But to do that, the Duchy had to go. On July 24th, Grandi forced a meeting of the Grand Council of Fascism. This body hadn't met since the war began. It was a humid Saturday night. The council members arrived at the Palazzo Venezia wearing their black-shirted uniforms, but many were hiding hand grenades or small pistols under their tunics, terrified that Mussolini's personal guard would massacre them. Mussolini entered the room looking tired, his eyes sunken. He spoke for 2 hours, a rambling, defensive speech blaming his generals and the treachery of the Italian people for the military defeats. Then, Dino Grandi stood up. In a move of incredible physical and political courage, he looked Mussolini in the eye and presented a resolution. The king should resume his full constitutional powers, effectively stripping Mussolini of his command. For 10 hours, the highest-ranking fascists in Italy debated. Ciano, Mussolini's son-in-law, voted against his father-in-law, a move that would eventually cost him his life. In the early hours of July 25th, the vote was taken. The count was 19-7 against the Duca. Mussolini looked stunned. He closed his folder and muttered, "You have provoked the crisis of the regime." Mussolini, ever the narcissist, believed this was nearly a parliamentary setback. He went home, slept, and the next afternoon went to his scheduled meeting with King Victor Emmanuel III at the Villa Savoia. He thought the king would support him against the council. Instead, the king met him at the door, and delivered the crushing blow. "My dear Deuce," the king said, "things are no longer working. Italy is in pieces. At this moment, you are the most hated man in Italy." As Mussolini walked out of the villa, bewildered and officially resigned, he was met not by his chauffeur, but by a captain of the Carabinieri. "For your own protection," the officer said, gesturing toward a waiting ambulance. It was a ruse. Mussolini was bundled into the back of the vehicle and driven away to a secret barracks. The Caesar of the Mediterranean was now a prisoner of the state. When the news was broadcast over the radio at 10:45 p.m. that night, Italy exploded. It was one of the most sudden and spontaneous outpourings of joy in European history. People poured into the streets of Rome, Naples, and Florence, waving Italian flags and tearing down the fascist littoral symbols from buildings. They dragged bronze busts of Mussolini through the gutters. There was no one to stop them. The dreaded black shirts, the militia that had terrorized Italy for 20 years, simply vanished, melting back into the civilian population to avoid the wrath of the crowds. For the USA, this was a massive psychological victory. President Franklin D. Roosevelt and Winston Churchill saw it as the first brick falling out of the Fortress Europe wall. However, the drama was far from over. While the new Italian government under Marshal Badoglio began secret negotiations with the Allies, Adolf Hitler was furious. He didn't trust the Italians for a second. He began pouring German divisions across the Alps, preparing to occupy Italy and rescue his old friend. Mussolini was moved from prison to prison, first to a volcanic island, then to a hotel atop the Gran Sasso d'Italia, a remote peak in the Apennine Mountains, accessible only by cable car. He thought he would be handed over to the Americans, but on September 12, 1943, in one of the most daring commando raids of the war, German paratroopers led by Otto Skorzeny landed gliders on the mountainside and whisked Mussolini away to Germany. What followed was a tragic coda. Hitler set Mussolini up as the puppet head of the Italian Social Republic in northern Italy, a regime that existed only under German bayonets. Mussolini was now a ghost dictator, presiding over a bloody civil war between fascist diehards and Italian partisans. He was forced to execute his own son-in-law, Ciano, for the treason of July 25th. The endgame came in April 1945. As Allied tanks broke into the Po Valley and the German lines collapsed, Mussolini tried to flee to Switzerland disguised as a German soldier in a convoy. He was recognized by a partisan at a checkpoint in Dongo. On April 28, 1945, the man who once promised a 1,000-year empire was executed by a firing squad in a small village by Lake Como. His body, along with his mistress Clara Petacci, was taken to Milan and hung upside down at a gas station in Piazzale Loreto, the very spot where fascists had previously displayed the bodies of executed partisans. The fall of Mussolini is a haunting reminder of the fragility of power built on vanity and violence. It started with a vote in a smoky room and ended in a gutter in Milan. For an American audience, the story of Mussolini's overthrow is the ultimate cautionary tale. It shows that even the most entrenched autocracies can vanish in a single night when the people, and eventually the leaders themselves, stop believing in the lie. Italy emerged from the rubble not as a new Roman Empire, but as a republic, finally waking up from a 21-year fever dream.